Good afternoon. The Broadband Bunch virtual learning series is now live. I want to welcome you this afternoon to our session on The Funding is Coming, the Funding is Coming. As you know, the Broadband Bunch podcast and Zero Touch Learning series are brought to you as always by our One Touch service, NTIA software, along with Utopia Fiber, DXTEL, Calix, and ITK Solutions Group. And be sure to follow us on our Facebook and Instagram and Twitter feed. You can also access the Broadband Bunch on your favorite podcasts, such as Spotify, Google, SoundCloud, Apple, and more. And just a quick reminder before I start our session. All sessions are interactive. We will be taking questions under the question segment of your GoToWebinar bar, and we welcome them throughout the session. We like to have the questions, and we will answer them as we can. We also record it, and it will be available on the ETI and the Broadband Bunch webinar in about 48 hours for your viewing. So thanks a lot for your participation. And now with that, let's start today's session. So since the onset of the pandemic, the question of whether a community needs the best possible broadband has been answered. Now all the questions revolve around how to get it. With the federal government's plans to disperse over $350 billion in funding to state and local governments, which they can use for broadband if they decide to, coming from the American Recovery ARPA, coupled with the additional $42.5 billion that is coming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we should have conquered, hopefully, the funding issue. But we need to move forward. And what is the best way for each community to move forward? And what steps should they be taking now in order to be prepared? With us today is Joanne Hovis, who is president of CTC Technology and Energy, a well-known consulting firm that has navigated many communities through the decision process. Joanne's knowledge about the business of operating a local telecom service and the needs and capabilities of the many local entities that she assists with give her a unique knowledge to lead this discussion. Welcome, Joanne. Joanne, as you look out on the local landscape, are you seeing a lot of interest in communities in getting better broadband? Are they thinking about how to use the ARPA funds or doing this soon in order to do this sooner rather than wait for the IIJA funds that may not come out till next year?
Yeah, Heather, I think that's exactly what is happening. My sense of it is that pretty much every community in America is going through some kind of analysis of what it should be doing with its American Rescue Plan Act funds. I think there is an understanding that communities have a lot more control over the ARPA fiscal recovery dollars than they will over anything under the IIJA, because those federal funds will flow through the states, and the states will determine what to do with them. And communities will have an opportunity to share their opinions and can certainly lobby their state legislators and their state broadband offices, but they will not be able to make these decisions themselves. Whereas with the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, they have almost complete discretion and flexibility. And that was true under the interim rules. But as you know, just 2 weeks ago, the Department of the Treasury released the final rules for the ARPA dollars for how they could be used for broadband projects. And the rules are extremely flexible and permissive. They effectively allow a community to define its own needs and use the funds to meet those needs. So this is really a first ever opportunity, not just in the scale of the dollars, but the enormous flexibility that every local community has to determine how to use those dollars. And of course, many of the states are using the American Rescue Plan Act dollars for broadband projects as well. For example, Georgia has a $300 million grant program that is active right now. But again, that's the state funds and a decision made by states, but the fiscal recovery dollars that went to local governments are effectively really unrestricted for what local governments can do. What I see happening really interestingly, I think at the local level, is that the question most communities are asking is not necessarily, what should I build? How do we get a new network built, or how do we supplement an existing network? The question is more along the lines of, do we fully understand what our broadband challenges are and what the moment really requires? For many communities, there's an awareness that there might be a lot of broadband service available, but not everybody can afford it, or that many who can afford it are not interested in using it, or that those who can't afford it but might be able to get support elsewhere to afford it don't know about those additional supports, such as, for example, on the topic of the funding is coming, there is considerable new funding to provide free or very low cost service to low-income households through a program that might last as long as 10 years. It's the new Affordable Connectivity Program. And communities are thinking about, what's our role in that? How do we maximize that? How do we make sure that that program benefits as many households in our jurisdiction as possible? So there's a mix of different questions being asked that start with, what are our needs? And then, second, what are these new funding sources and how can they support us addressing those needs, of which infrastructure is going to be one of the primary areas.
And let me just do a follow-up, just so the audience knows. I believe that almost out of the 350 billion, I keep wanting to say that so that people know it's 6 times the money that's in the Infrastructure Act bill. It's roughly 50-50 going to state and locations directly. Do I remember that correctly? And so are you seeing most localities use it for broadband, or are there a wide range? Is there any differentiate? Are you seeing a preponderance? Because I know my sense is, and just from doing these webinars since March of 2019, that people are desperate to be connected for every aspect of their life, education, healthcare, government. And I wondered if that's being reflected in how they're using those funds.
So I think that many of the decisions have not yet been made. The planning and the decision making is underway right now. There are a very significant number of communities who've already decided that they're going to use their fiscal recovery dollars under the American Rescue Plan Act. Some of which went to the state, some of which went to the localities. You're 100% right. A substantial number are planning to use it for broadband networks, either themselves or in partnership with the private sector. But a lot have not yet made that determination. I think there's an enormous amount of strategizing and planning going on right now. And the dollars don't have to be committed to a particular project under the federal rules yet. So there's a little bit of breathing time to make some determinations about needs, priorities, and so on. But the level of interest in broadband is unlike anything we've ever seen. And I started working on internet policy and strategy for public entities at the advent of the commercial internet, which was the mid-1990s. And the level of engagement right now among local communities is exponentially higher than ever in the past. And that obviously is because local elected officials are hearing from their constituents about the importance of this issue, and government officials are hearing it. And the pandemic obviously illustrated the criticality of it. Now, that sense of need married to the availability of funding is a very big deal. But I think it's probably safe to say that just about every community is contemplating broadband, but might not have yet made the decision that that's how the funds will be used. Or if they have decided on broadband, they may not have made the decision about what kind of broadband project they would like to use those funds for. Is it focused on infrastructure? Is it focused on adoption? Is it going to be a public effort? Is it going to be public-private? Is it going to be to try to support the nonprofit community and its outreach to members of the community who are not yet? There are a wide range of different ways this can be done. Although most commonly, I think the funds will go toward infrastructure.
Yep. And what happens to communities who currently have a provider that is giving them 25 and 3? Didn't the Treasury rules, and don't we anticipate that the BEAD money under NTIA will allow us to build better than that? Because we all know that standard a substandard.
I think that there was widespread agreement just about everywhere that 25 by 3 is not an acceptable standard for broadband. Certainly not for a household of more than one person. Certainly not at a time of enormous need. And even if it might be barely adequate in a given moment, it does not prepare any community for the future. It does not deliver the kinds of services that will allow a community to compete for jobs or companies or residents or lifestyle or anything else. So the flexibility around how to use these funds, I think, reflects something of a bipartisan consensus. And I can't believe I'm saying those words, bipartisan consensus, but that really does exist in Washington right now, this understanding that 25 by 3 is not broadband. Nobody thinks that is adequate. And in fact, Congress has effectively changed the definition of broadband through these new funding programs, again, in a bipartisan way, through multiple pieces of legislation, some of them under a Republican administration, some a Democratic administration, different control of the Congress for these different pieces of legislation, but really effectively pushing the definition of broadband toward 100 by 20 rather than 25 by 3. And then in addition to that, pushing the requirement for how new funds are spent, whereas public funds, toward 100 by 100. Now at the FCC, the definition is still 25 by 3, and that may stay the case at the FCC, but the FCC, frankly, is going to be playing catch up to what is happening among policymakers at the state level in states of all political colors, as well as in Washington in a bipartisan way, which is that we've moved beyond 25 by 3. And the funding programs reflect that. Funding programs give the communities, in the case of the ARPA fiscal recovery dollars, and give the states, in the case of the programs that send the funding through the states, give them flexibility to fund areas that have 25 by 3 and not to be restricted, because there's a recognition that 25 by 3 doesn't mean that a community is truly served.
So does that mean we're going to see, I'm terrified to say this word out loud, overbuilding of new networks, overbuilding of old networks that don't meet 100 by 20?
So I think that's yet to be determined, because a lot of the funds have not yet been deployed by state and local government. But I do think there will be areas where that is the case. For the most part, my experience working for a number of states with large rural areas, but even for smaller states, is that for smaller states that are very dense, that don't have as much rural, my sense is that policymakers, whether it's a state that's more heavily Republican or state that's more heavily Democratic, in both cases, the prioritization of the state funds is going toward areas that don't have anything. Okay. But just because something has 25 by 3, it's no longer considered adequate. Same way that we moved past 10 by 1 or 4 by 1 many years ago. There are, however, I think, cities, particularly where there's a single broadband provider and significant affordability issues, where we will see what you termed overbuilds. And what I will call that is competition. Right. And what Washington has really done is give the communities permission to do that. that if that is how they choose to spend their funds, that is within their discretion, at least with regard to the rules for the programs. I don't think you'll see it very much in communities where there is robust competition. Like where I live, there are 3 wireline broadband providers that can serve me. I don't expect that the county where I live is going to be particularly interested in trying to create yet another opportunity, because 3, at least in the United States, is as good as it gets. But there are lots of places where there's a single broadband provider where they pass by certain low-income multi-dwelling units and don't provide service inside that building, or the service is not affordable, and all the benefits of competition are missing. And I do think we will see some community investments in those kinds of markets.
So let's jump into the core of what we want to talk about today, which is the steps that these areas should be taking today to prepare for the broadband investment. What kinds of questions should they be asking and answering in order to make an informed decision about what direction they go in for broadband deployment?
Can I share my screen?
Yes, please.
All right, great. Let me show you all a visual representation of how I think about this, and hopefully this will be a useful way.
Go to slide, Joanne, so we don't.
Okay, I will.
So we don't see your mail come in.
Yeah, no problem. I am just trying to figure out how, right now I am just seeing you, Heather. I'm not seeing my slide deck. So I'm going to work on getting that done.
We are seeing the slide where you go step by step.
Okay. Yeah. My challenge is that I am not seeing it, and I'm not quite sure why that is. Give me just a moment. All right, there we go. How's that better?
Perfect.
All right, good. So, here's one way to understand in a very simplified way, the steps that I think every community that is thinking about broadband as an area for investment of its ARPA dollars or any dollars, how they should think about the things that need to be done, and a rigorous process that allows for robust planning, but also protecting your resources and making sure that you are on the right track. And one way to understand all of this is that the blue boxes are data collection and business and strategic efforts. All right, let's say data collection and planning, and to some degree, public policy analysis. The green boxes are technical or engineering tasks, and the orange boxes are financial planning tasks. And starting up at the left, at the top on the left, is the setting of requirements, goals, and priorities. And there is no more important point that I could make to any community than that this is the critical place to start. We don't ever want to start with the solution, because that solution may not be really targeted toward a challenge or a problem that has been identified. You want to start by understanding that problem, understanding that challenge, and then prioritizing among all of those challenges to know what you can address, what you choose to address first and foremost, so that you know how to use your resources wisely. But the critical first set of steps is understanding the requirements of your community. What is missing? What are the needs? And that allows you then to determine what your goals are and set your priorities. And when I say the requirements or the gaps, the needs, I think I would say, think about it this way. Is the challenge in your community that there is insufficient broadband competition? Is the challenge that there is a complete lack of broadband infrastructure and services? Is the challenge that There are services there and maybe even competition, but there are too many in the community who are not able to access those services because of an affordability issue, or frankly, in some cases, maybe because of language barriers or other concerns. Understanding where the gaps exist is the first and most critical issue. If you determine that these gaps don't really have to do with infrastructure or services, but have to do with things like adoption, affordability, lack of access to broadband-enabled devices such as laptops and tablets and so on, then in some ways, this whole chart that flows from here is not the right one for you. If your challenges based on the data you collect turn out to be those kinds of considerations, then there's a whole other analysis that is necessary and other mechanisms, and frankly, other federal funding streams coming down the road, including the Affordable Connectivity Plan, but also what Congress called the digital equity programs that were part of IIJA that will be defined and developed by NTIA and the Department of Commerce in the next few months. And those plans, those programs will then potentially become tools for addressing the kinds of affordability, lack of device, lack of digital skills, language challenge type efforts. And we'll call those programmatic efforts. And frankly, I think every community, in addition to having an infrastructure plan, should have a plan for dealing with those kinds of challenges. Some folks call them digital equity plans. Some call them digital opportunity plans. There are lots of different ways of understanding it, but at its core, that is a set of strategies to address gaps in internet utilization, in broadband maximization, in making sure that every member of your community is connected to the internet and that your community is thus benefiting from an economic, healthcare, education, et cetera standpoint. That's a critical part of planning.
Right, and knows how to use the internet for those purposes. A lot of times it's an education issue.
That's exactly it. And there are lots of programmatic solutions and best practices for addressing that once you understand those challenges. And I'm not going to talk about those in any detail other than to say that I really recommend that every community think of that as a companion piece to an infrastructure plan. I'll talk now about what an infrastructure plan should look like, but don't let it be only that. The equity or opportunity analysis and strategy is just as necessary a piece of this, and a very fruitful opportunity for partnering with the private sector, partnering with the ISPs in your community to try to make sure that everyone is on, or as many folks as possible are on, and are maximizing the value. And that wherever you can leverage those new federal resources to support them, including to support low-income use of broadband, that you are making the best of that. So let me put that aside now. That if you determine that there is an infrastructure and service gap in your community, and that might be that there's 25.3, but you think better would be better. And by the way, it probably would be. In fact, it certainly would be. Or you'd like to stimulate competition, or there is no broadband at all and you want to make sure a network gets built. However you define that, that is now the gap that you are trying to address and solve. And you have accomplished what is required there by the box on the left. There are a bunch of different data sets that you can be using to determine this, and there are data collection mechanisms at the local level that are also best practices where you're leveraging existing data sets and developing your own data that is not provided by the federal government, because federal government data collection around broadband is notoriously bad. Many of the states do a better job, and that might be a good resource for you, but you might need to do it locally. And then you've got a whole lot of data about what the challenges are, what the existing services are, and you are then able to move on to that second box where you have a map of the existing service footprint. You know what is served, what is unserved, where there is competition, where there is not, what kinds of services, not just what infrastructure, but what kinds of services are available in different parts of your community. And ideally, you also know how those services are priced. And that's just part of all of that data collection. You now have what is really the holy grail of broadband planning, which is a good map. Hopefully sometime soon we will get a good map from the federal government, but unfortunately that has not yet happened. In the meantime, it falls to our communities and our states to develop their own.
And just let me interject there so that people understand that getting the money from NTIA is dependent on those maps being issued and being accepted. And the earliest people think that's going to happen is fourth quarter 2022. So it's highly unlikely any of this money will start flowing until early 2023. So this ARPA money is what you have right now to work with.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. That's an incredibly important point. The IIJA funds and what's called the BEAD program, what Congress did is it established a formula that the data inputs to the formula for allocation of the funds will be based on the FCC map. That FCC map is not only nowhere close to being done, but it's really not even been started yet. And this is another reason why communities and states are well advised to develop their own maps so that you are reliant on the FCC doing this, but also because if you have your own data, you will have opportunity. Congress required the FCC to allow communities to challenge the FCC map when it is developed. So you will be able to advocate for the needs of your own community, and your state will be able to do the same thing with the best data that you have got, rather than relying on data that may not fairly assess the lack of infrastructure in your community. So multiple uses for that mapping if you are able to do it. And the mapping then leads to the next step, which is that now that you understand what you do have and what you don't have, and you've defined your gaps, you can, from an engineering standpoint, build a design at the systems level, at the planning level, of what you would like to see there that doesn't currently exist. And when I say systems level, what I mean is it's not a blueprint, it's a planning document that says, this is the infrastructure and the technology that we choose. This is where we want it to go. These are the technical standards for performance that we require. These are the routes where it will go. Here are the other components. And all of this rolls up into a total capital cost to build all of this. And then very importantly, an understanding of what the operating costs to operate it will be as well, because just building it is only part of this. But the total cost of ownership is an important part of understanding the implications. And that then becomes a tool for starting to do some financial planning. What you see there is the green arrow going from the design and cost estimates to the financial model. And what we mean there by financial model is this is the point at which the community takes the data that it has about the gaps and what it'll cost to fill those gaps, that is the cost estimate, and from a capital and an operating standpoint, and builds a model to understand, given all of this, how much revenue will need to come into this network over time to cover all of the costs that it will have. If your American Rescue Plan Act dollars are going to pay the capital costs to build the network, then you will only really need the revenues to cover operating costs. But you want to be really sure you have built in all of those operating costs so you understand just what your risk is. If the American Rescue Plan Act dollars are only going to be a piece of it, and you might have to finance the other part, or there's some kind of a collaboration with the private sector, then the model will tell you what you need in the way of revenues in order to make sure that whatever those financial parameters are, you are able to achieve positive cash flow. So one way of understanding it is that the design and cost estimate box tells me it's going to cost X dollars, and the financial model box then tells me, given that, I'm going to need annual revenues of Y dollars in order for this thing to pay for itself. And then at the same time, we recommend, and this can be done later, but at the same time is not a bad time, a market analysis, demand research effectively to determine, given the community, will that number of Y dollars in revenue that we need in order for this thing to pay for itself, will we be able to get that much revenue from paying customers within our community? Is the market ready for this thing? Is there sufficient demand? So you see how I'm thinking about it. The financial model tells me what kind of revenue I need in order to achieve positive cash flow. The market research tells me whether that number with regard to revenues is realistic given where the community is at the current moment. Are there other services? Are lots of people turning to satellite? Are lots of people instead going mobile only? Is the community able to afford the services that I'm thinking about? All of this should really be doable given your American Rescue Plan Act dollars. If you are putting some of that into building the network, the economics of this really should work because it's reducing the financing costs, but you want to lay all of that out and very rigorously analyze it so that your community is not undertaking risk that you haven't already understood and anticipated. So market and demand research tells you whether you're going to be able to bring in the kind of revenue you need to support the network that you would like to build. I can go into lots of detail about how to do that, but we generally recommend something that is going to allow you to make statistically significant conclusions and that will serve as a really useful tool if you're going the public-private partnership the public-private partnership way, a tool for helping your private partner also to understand what the market looks like. And then all of that then rolls up into what we'll call the partnership strategy. If you decide that as a community, you would like to build this into a partnership model with a private entity where you are sharing some of the risk, perhaps you as a community are covering some of the capital cost for that private partner and they're making commitments to build on a ubiquitous basis in return for that. Or perhaps you as a community are building out the infrastructure that you then own and you lease to a private partner and they then provide services and pay you for access to the network. There are a wide range of different partnership models. I can certainly talk about that at length, but you've got all of the underlying data that you need in order to develop a partnership strategy and to do the outreach to the private sector, to the incumbent and competitive ISPs and other entities in and around your community who might be your partner. That is the next step. Coming out of that, and that is hours of discussion in and of itself, but hopefully coming out of that, you have a strategy. And that strategy then allows you to figure out what do you need to finance? What are you going to give as a grant based on your ARPA dollars? And is there a strategy where you and your private partner, or you alone, if you don't have a partnership strategy, seek additional grant funding from your state or from the federal government? Because there will be state grant programs. There will be very, very generous state grant programs given all the money that's flowing to the state. We don't know the parameters of most of them yet. They'll be developed in the next couple of years, but they might be opportunities for your community. There will also be federal grant programs. There's not as much money at the federal government, but there's an opportunity open right now through the US Department of Agriculture. There's another one through the Economic Development Administration. There are definitely grant opportunities and more to come at the federal level. So that strategy then helps you to support the financing plan that you have for how you are going to pay for all of this, either with or without a partner. That leads to development of a full business plan, and that then leads to your execution plan rather critically. Let me take one more minute to just give you an illustration of what I'm talking about, because I think that all of this is all very theoretical and frankly pretty dull until we start talking about where it's been put in place by a community itself. And I'll share with you an example, which is Scott County, Kentucky. And Scott County is a large county near Lexington, between Lexington and Frankfort. It includes a town called Georgetown, but it also includes some pretty extensive rural areas that are entirely unserved. And about a year and a half ago, Scott County went through a exactly this process, really, collecting data to understand what is served and what is unserved, defining its goals and its priorities and its needs in light of the community's interests. And what it determined is that it wanted to get fiber to the premises in all of the unserved rural parts of the community, but it frankly wanted better and faster and higher speeds in the more populated areas where there was already a cable broadband provider, and that provider, as an aside, was Charter. The county went through a process then of developing the maps and doing a whole lot of field work to understand what the needs are and to define what is unserved and to build some pretty detailed maps, and then went through a design and cost estimation process to understand if it were to do all of this itself, what would it cost? Built a model and a partnership strategy out of that, and actually then, as a result of building a financial model and that partnership strategy, released an RFP after all of this work was done to the private sector. The county got half a dozen responses, of which most were really thoughtful, serious responses, and ended up making an award to its private partner, which is indeed Charter Communications Cable Company. And Charter's commitment in return for a financial contribution from the county is that it will build fiber to the premises in all of the unserved areas of the county, and it will upgrade its infrastructure in the areas that are already served with cable broadband so that much faster speeds are feasible. And as a result of that partnership strategy and negotiations, the county and Charter then applied for a federal grant under the NTIA BIP program, the Broadband Infrastructure Program that was created through the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and is waiting to hear final word on whether that grant application has been funded or not. But the partnership strategy is in place regardless, and the network will be built whether or not the grant is secured. If the grant is secured, it just reduces the amount of funding that the county will have to come up with. And
so I think that's a great example for our audience to hear about, Joanne, because often we don't know or think we know that the incumbent would step up if we had an open process where they could see that they would get funding towards stepping up. You know, this is a good case where Charter did step up. And, you know, there might be other incidences where an incumbent, either telco or cable company, would be willing to become a partner and invest in a community. You don't necessarily want to just go to them alone because that sort of takes your leverage away. But I think it's very interesting to hear that they did step up in this area.
I absolutely agree with you, Heather. I would not go to them alone. The benefit of a competitive process and getting as many bidders as possible, as many potential partners as possible, I think that's really important. But I am definitely seeing incumbents with new interest in this kind of public-private partnership. AT&T recently announced something along these lines in a part of rural Indiana. Cincinnati Bell is doing something along these lines throughout its footprint. There are extensive partnerships between localities in New Hampshire and Consolidated Communications, the ILEC there, and the cable industry is seeking them as well. Now, the competitive side of the industry also presents a really remarkable opportunity for partnerships because competitors are very amenable to this sort of thing. So in this particular case, the awardee was Charter, but there are a couple of dozen, more than that, competitors who focus on fiber to the premises and who are very interested in partnerships with local communities. So, and there are a range of partnerships. It doesn't have to be just a grant in return for enforceable promises, although that is one reasonable approach. We certainly see lots of communities building the fiber or conduit infrastructure and then making it available to private partners who will operate the network and pay the community for access to that infrastructure. That's another very reasonable and replicable model. And then, of course, we've got lots of communities who are just going to build and own and operate it for themselves. as should be their prerogative, as determined by their elected officials in consultation with their constituents. But this is really, yeah.
What are some of the tipping factors in whether a community decides to build and operate it itself versus building the infrastructure and then letting a third party, probably a well-known ISP, run the network for them? What are some of the issues that make that decision?
Heather, I think it really has to do with how the community thinks about function and risk, allocation of function and risk. And it's not only well-known ISPs, just as an aside, I don't know if you saw a week before last, there was an announcement from Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is a very substantial sized city of a couple 100,000 people, that the city is going to build a ubiquitous fiber network throughout, and Ting Internet is going to lease capacity on that network and provide services and pay for access to the fiber. That's a small but really excellent competitive ISP. So your partner could come from almost anywhere, almost any size, and we, I think, would encourage that competitive process to see who the range of partners could be. To more directly answer your question, the tipping point, I think, has to do with function and risk, as I said. If you think about a broadband project, the two major areas, the three areas, let's say, that a community should think about are these. First of all, there's construction, design and construction of the fiber network. Second, there is operations, which is running the communications network itself, standing up the optical networking gear, hiring network engineers, running a network operations center, and all of those pieces. And then third, there is service provision. Billing and collections, marketing and sales, delivery of services to the customer, and managing the customer relationship. So construction, operations, and then service provision, or let's call that market. And there is risk with regard to all three of those. Construction risk: might the thing be more expensive? Could costs go up? Will the lack of available equipment, given supply chain issues right now, create delays? Those kinds of risks that come with construction. Operations risk: is it going to be challenging to hire network engineers? Is that going to be something, operating a network on an ongoing basis, is that going to be something that the community really is engaged and able to do and wants to do? And then third, market risk around service provision. What if there aren't enough customers? What if the pricing is not right? What if satellite services suddenly come down in price and we see lots of folks defect to that, and so revenues are lower than anticipated? And I think a community that is thinking this through and thinking about what its role should be should think about those three things. Is it well set up to do the construction? And is it interested in that construction risk? Many communities actually are very well set up for that. From a public works standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, it's what they do all the time. They've been doing it for a couple 100 years. They are experts at running a big public works project. So that may be something they're interested in, and think that they could play a role in that. Operations, the community may look at that. Is that something they want to do? Is that something they feel well situated to do? And is that risk that they're interested in? And then market risk, which is where I think it becomes most challenging, where a lot of communities will look at that and say, we're good on the infrastructure side. That's something we're very good at, but we're not sure that we want to be in the market risk business of providing services and trying to optimize for pricing and revenue and customer service and so on. And so maybe that is somewhere where we will seek a private partner, but we'll take on the construction and operations piece. Every community will have a different calculus around those three big buckets of effort and risk, and how they think about those three things is going to point them in the direction of the right model. If they're comfortable with all three of those, then municipal broadband might be exactly the right mix. If they're not comfortable with any of those, then providing a grant to a private company in return for enforceable promises might be the right mix. But if they're comfortable with some of those three, but not all, then there might be a really interesting public-private collaboration that they can develop with a private partner.
How often do we see multiple ISPs responding to provide those non-infrastructure services? How often do you see it?
Pretty frequently, actually, depending on the market and depending on the timing. So if this had been 4 or 5 years ago, my answer would have been somewhat different. But I think that in the current moment, there is so much excitement about fiber in particular, and so much of a race on among ISPs to get into the fiber business and to get into as many markets as possible. You know, in part thanks to you, Heather, after all these years of talking about the importance of fiber, Wall Street has caught up, Washington has caught up, the state capitals have caught up, and the investors have caught up. I think there is a lot of excitement about fiber right now, and a perfect example is probably the one from Colorado Springs, where they had multiple bidders for the opportunity. I'm trying to think.
Not so many open access networks.
No, most of these are actually open access.
Oh, okay.
The beauty of a big fiber network is that it can support multiple entities from a technical standpoint. Now, the market may not be able to support multiple entities. I think that's something to think about, right? If you are a community and you are hoping to see lots of competition, it's important to note that even if you make that fiber available, there may not be enough revenue opportunity that there would be a second user of your fiber. It may just be that first one.
Yeah.
But that
we generally think that there's probably at least 10,000 subscribers to make any kind of multi-ISP environment work. That's just the rule of thumb I've seen. Which is a pretty big, you know, now you're starting to get into a bigger community.
Right, and inevitably, if you are seeking a public-private partnership, your private partner is comparing this opportunity to all of its other opportunities and looking for the highest return on investment. So the market has to be attractive.
What are you seeing about these private third-party builders like Lit or Underline? Are you seeing many of those popping up, and how do those work with the partnership at the community?
So that, you know, they all have somewhat different models. There's a lot of entrepreneurial effort from companies who are pioneering new models in communities, such as Lit and Underline. Sci-Fi Networks is another one, but they're probably a substantial handful. But the models are all different, and they may also differ from community to community. Another reason why it's worth going through an engagement with potential partners and then a competitive process. But Underline, for example, has said that they are interested in doing projects that may involve a city investing, but they also are bringing private resources to the table and may do projects where the city does not necessarily have to have any financial commitment in order to do it. Whereas Lit Communities is much more focused on the local community making an investment. And they are effectively serving as a developer as well as an execution partner. So the companies are innovating at all times. They're relatively early in that innovation cycle. There aren't dozens of examples yet, but they will emerge in coming years. And you know, all I would share with any community is there's really an opportunity for creativity with potential partners here. You just want to be absolutely sure that that partner has the technical, financial, and managerial capabilities to do what they are promising you that they are doing. And that should be part of your risk analysis in selecting your partner.
I guess the other question is, are communities that are doing these public-private partnerships, are they precluded from getting federal money because they're not carriers per se? Are they, have they removed that you have to be a designated carrier? You know what I'm saying? Do you understand the question I'm asking?
Yeah, I do, Heather. I think for purposes of some of the federal funds that flow through the FCC, the universal service funds, some of them require recipients of the funds to be eligible
right.
carriers. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, the dollars that are appropriated by Congress in the last couple of years under the CARES Act and then the Consolidated Appropriations Act and then ARPA and now the IIJA, they don't have those limitations, but the non appropriated funds that are universal service funds that are based on fees on all of our phone bills that go through the FCC, they generally do have that requirement. That is a case-by-case legal analysis that every community should do with its private partner where necessary. But depending on your state rules, a community can certainly become an ETC. And it's just, I can't answer that in any authoritative way other than to say consult an attorney, and there will be a way to manage that set of challenges.
Even if you're in a state that doesn't want the community to be a carrier.
Yeah, in a state where some of what you're considering is precluded by state law, even more importantly, consult an attorney.
Right.
There may be exceptions or paths forward regardless, and there may be ways to craft your public-private partnership such that it does not create that particular set of problems. That should be really doable. By the way, I should note, and I'm sure you all know this, but the IIJA requires that a state, in order to access its funds under the BEAD program, not preclude, I don't remember the exact language, but not preclude the participation of nonprofit and public entities. I don't know that that means that more states will embrace municipal broadband, but I do think it means that we are seeing general, it's one of the many indications of a shift away from an anti-community broadband model as a nation. As have been changes in state law in a couple of states in recent years, including some pretty conservative states like Arkansas.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me ask you another question is, when we do these bids in these rural areas, is it more important to have an upgrade in service than to have competition? I think you've talked about competition, especially in an urban or suburban area. I too have access to 3 broadband providers in Leesburg, but do you think for some of these rural communities, just the fact that they can upgrade is more important than any having a competitive environment?
I think every community has to make that determination for itself. That really speaks to what its requirements and goals and priorities are. And that is the beauty of localism and the beauty of the flexibility that communities have under the American Rescue Plan Act, the fiscal recovery dollars. Both of those things are really important, but it's a public policy decision how to prioritize them.
We have a few minutes for questions. Are there any questions out in the audience? I haven't seen any. Joanne, can you think of anything I haven't asked you? or that we haven't touched on?
I will share one thing, coming back to where I started about the importance of understanding the needs in your community, and building a digital opportunity or digital equity plan at the same time as you address the infrastructure and service challenges. This is in that way also a truly unique moment. I don't know if we'll ever see anything like this again. It took a pandemic for all of this to happen and for Washington, D.C. to really understand the needs of our communities. But what I would say is that the Affordable Connectivity Program gives every local government and every state government in America an opportunity we have never had before. And what that is that we have a federal funding stream that can be applied to get low-income households access to broadband internet in a way that is paid for by the federal government, and that local communities don't have to come up with the money. And this is through the Affordable Connectivity Program, which has more than $14 billion in it and is projected to last somewhere between 5 and 10 years. That is a long runway. And my sense of this is that for a community that recognizes that 20% or perhaps more of the households located there are not connected because of affordability challenges, this is your moment to build an outreach campaign, build an effort, build collaborations with your schools and AARP and your local nonprofits and your social service agencies and your state to distribute materials everywhere and to provide resources and support and guidance to those low-income families so that they can connect to high-quality internet paid for by the federal government. And we are recommending that for communities who are really focused on that also, they consider even going as far as standing up a call center, make calls to every low-income household in the city or the town or the county, and make sure that they know about this program and that lack of knowledge of it is not getting in the way of them using it. And in this kind of effort, your private ISPs will also be your partners, because this program exists in part because the big ISPs asked Congress to create it. And for big ISPs, for small ISPs, the idea that 20% of Americans who don't currently subscribe to broadband, the idea that they might now be able to subscribe to broadband is very exciting from a business standpoint from those ISPs. But it also means that for them, investing in lower income areas, upgrading infrastructure in lower income areas, all of that is more economically viable because there is a funding mechanism to make sure that those folks are able to pay for the service, which is to say the FCC will pay. So it's win-win in every way, and it should be one of the things that you are thinking about as a community, whether or not you're doing an infrastructure program. And if you are, by the way, this program can support your new broadband network, whether you own and operate it or the private sector does, because what it does effectively de-risks the areas of your community that otherwise might have been very high risk because adoption rates would have been low. It has the potential to increase those rates. So that's the final thing I would say. An adoption strategy overlays your infrastructure strategy if you're really going to maximize this current moment.
We have a couple of questions have come in. First of all, somebody asked about getting the slides in the webinar, and I think I mentioned at the beginning, this will be posted on the Broadband Bunch website, which is broadbandbunch.com, in probably about 24 to 48 hours. You can also get it through the NTIA webinar. And Joanne, we can share it with you so you can put it up on your website. Then here's a question. States have a huge role and responsibility in getting this right. Is there a best way for cooperative providers and experienced consulting engineering firms alike to equip states to build and execute a workable 5-year plan that will utilize the BEAD funding in the most advantageous way for their underserved and unserved communities? Now, I'm going to let Joanne answer that from the state she's working with. I will let you know that there is a requirement that local governments have the ability to comment, written comment, and challenge whatever the state turns in for its plan to NTIA. So Joanne, have you been talking to communities about how they can best approach their states to help them get ready to submit a 5-year plan?
Yeah, this is a hard one because it really depends on the state. Some of the states are really engaged. Yeah, they've built staffs, they've built institutional knowledge, they've been busy, they've built maps in many cases. And then some of the states are really only just now getting started. I think what I would encourage is messaging to your state elected officials about the criticality of this, that they need to prioritize it. And if their state is just now getting started, they're going to need not only to prioritize, but they're going to need real resources in order to do what is necessary. No more single person state broadband offices.
Right.
This can take dozens of people. The other thing is, I would say that the states are all aware that there needs to be consultation with local communities and the co-ops and so on. They know that. It's going to be a matter of whether they've got the capacity to do it. Organized through your municipal league or your association of counties in addition, so that your voice is heard very loud. But local input is a critical piece of this. And frankly, in my experience, it's a best practice for even grant awards. The states that consult their localities about whether the localities think that potential private sector grantees are in their best interests, or build in incentives for the community to be part of the grant application, those states are giving out really better grants than the ones who don't have consultation built in.
So somebody is asking about, they're mentioning that the ARPA is available now, whereas IIJA is not available until next year. So insight on the IIJA timelines. Well, the NTIA is under a statutory requirement to issue what's called a notice of fund availability, which is basically its rules on how it's going to implement this in 180 days. Now, whether they get to that or not is another question. And then once that's been released, then states need to file what's called a letter of intent. And once the letter of intent is accepted, they'll get their first $5 million, which is what they'll use to stand up their broadband planning process. But then we all have to wait until they should be working on it, but then we have to wait for the maps to be done. And as we said, we don't anticipate the maps being done, and they can be challenged, the maps being done and made public until the end of third or fourth quarter 2022. So that will dictate when the beginning of the state planning and disbursement process will begin. So I would say minimum the first quarter, end of first quarter, probably first half of 2023. Does that sound reasonable to you, Joanne? Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas with the ARPA money, half of it was sent last May and the other half comes this May. So your cities, towns, and states have that money. I'm just not sure they've all figured out how to use it or what they want to use it on. Do we have any other questions? We've gone long. Well, thank you, Joanne. This was great. You and I discussed whether we could do it just Q&A, and we certainly had no problem filling the hour plus. And as I said, recording will be made available, and then just check back on our website in a couple of days. And this will wrap up this edition. Please join us the next time. In the next month, we'll be starting to focus in on these individual ownership plans. So we will feature one on partnerships, we'll feature one on municipal build, we'll feature one on going all private routes. So stay tuned and watch for our upcoming announcements. And Joanne, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Heather.
Bye, everyone.